The crack of gunfire split the late afternoon stillness, echoing through the rugged Colorado foothills as Nora Miller's body tensed with fear. What had begun as a routine journey into town for supplies had turned into a desperate fight for survival on the lonesome trail to Montezuma. The year was 1876, and the promise of silver in the mountains had brought both fortune seekers and desperate men to this wild corner of Colorado territory. "Give us the money, lady," a rough voice called out as Nora clutched her reins tighter, her knuckles white against the worn leather. 3 masked men had emerged from behind a cluster of ponderosa pines that flanked the narrow dirt trail, their revolvers trained directly at her. Nora had left her father's homestead with nothing more than a small purse containing the proceeds from their last cattle sale, money desperately needed for winter supplies. "I don't have much," she called out, her voice steadier than she felt. At 22, Nora had grown up in these mountains, but the increasing lawlessness that accompanied the silver boom had made even familiar trails treacherous. "Don't matter how much. Hand it over." The tallest of the 3 men stepped forward, his eyes cold slits behind his bandana mask. Nora's hand moved slowly toward her saddlebag, where her father's old Remington revolver lay hidden. Years of living in mining country had taught her never to travel unarmed. Her fingers had just brushed the butt of the pistol when the first shot rang out, kicking up dirt near her horse's hooves. The startled animal reared, nearly throwing her from the saddle. "Next one won't miss," the bandit shouted. In that moment of terror, Nora made her decision. She yanked the revolver free and fired wildly in the direction of her attackers, spurring her horse simultaneously. The animal leapt forward as more shots exploded around her. A burning sensation tore across her upper arm, and she knew she'd been hit. But adrenaline kept her moving, bent low over her horse's neck as she raced toward a thicket of trees that might offer cover. Behind her, hoofbeats pounded as the bandits gave chase. 2 more shots whistled past her head. Nora fired back blindly over her shoulder, her breath coming in desperate gasps as pain bloomed through her arm. A half-mile away, Yates McAllister had been tracking a wounded deer when the first shots reached his ears. The 26-year-old cowboy dropped into a crouch, his hand automatically moving to the Colt holstered at his hip. Working as a ranch hand for the Diamond, Kay Spread for the past 3 years had taught him that gunfire in these parts rarely signaled anything good. When more shots followed in quick succession, Yates abandoned his hunt. Swinging onto his chestnut gelding, he urged the animal toward the commotion, riding hard through the scrub and pine. As he crested a small rise, he spotted the scene below a woman on horseback fleeing from 3 mounted pursuers, gun smoke hanging in the air between them. Without hesitation, Yates drew his revolver and spurred his horse down the slope. The woman's horse stumbled suddenly, pitching forward as it caught a hoof in a gopher hole. Yates watched in horror as she was thrown from the saddle, landing hard on the rocky ground. The 3 bandits closed in on their fallen prey, and Yates fired 2 warning shots into the air. "That's far enough," he shouted, his voice carrying across the distance between them. The outlaws wheeled around, spotting the lone rider bearing down on them with a drawn weapon. For a moment, they seemed to consider their odds 3 against 1, but when Yates fired again, this time sending a bullet dangerously close to the tallest bandit, their resolve faltered. "Ain't worth dying for." One of them called out, and as a group, they turned their horses and galloped away, disappearing into the trees on the far side of the clearing. Yates rode hard to where the woman lay motionless on the ground. Dismounting in a fluid motion, he knelt beside her, relieved to see her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Blood stained the sleeve of her blue cotton dress. "Madam," he said gently, touching her shoulder, "can you hear me?" Nora's eyes fluttered open, confusion giving way to alarm as she took in the stranger leaning over her. She tried to scramble backward, wincing as pain shot through her injured arm. "Easy now," Yates said, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "Those men are gone. You're safe." Nora's gaze darted around, confirming the bandits had indeed fled. Her horse stood several yards away, favoring its right foreleg. "You're hurt," Yates observed, nodding toward her bloodied arm. "It's just a graze," Nora replied, though the burning sensation suggested otherwise. She tried to stand but swayed unsteadily as dizziness overtook her. Yates caught her before she could fall. "Whoa there. Let's take a look at that arm first." Despite her protests, he gently examined the wound, removing his bandana to create a makeshift bandage. "Bullet tore through the flesh but didn't hit bone. Still, you're losing blood. We need to get you patched up proper." "I need to get to town," Nora insisted, thinking of her father waiting for the supplies she'd never reached Montezuma to purchase. "Town's still 4 miles off and your horse is lame," Yates pointed out. "My camp's just over that ridge. I've got medical supplies there. Let me help you, then I'll see you safely to Montezuma." Nora hesitated, studying the stranger's face. His eyes were a clear hazel beneath the brim of his worn Stetson, his expression open and concerned. In a territory where trust often came at a steep price, something in his steady gaze made her believe he genuinely wanted to help. "I'm Nora Miller," she said finally. "Yates McAllister," he replied with a slight tip of his hat. "Ranch hand at the Diamond K." The Diamond K was well known, one of the larger cattle operations in the county, with a reputation for honest dealings. It eased Nora's mind somewhat. "All right, Mr. McAllister, I accept your help." Yates nodded, carefully helping her to her feet. He led both horses with one hand while supporting Nora with the other as they made their way toward his camp. The sun had begun its descent behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the trail. His camp proved to be a small but orderly setup in a protected hollow, a canvas tent, small fire ring, and his gear neatly arranged. Yates helped Nora to a seat on a fallen log while he rummaged through his saddlebags, producing a worn but clean tin box containing basic medical supplies. "This will hurt," he warned as he prepared to clean the wound. Nora nodded grimly, biting her lip as he poured whiskey over the injury. Tears sprang to her eyes, but she didn't cry out. Yates worked with surprising gentleness for a man with such calloused hands, cleaning and bandaging the wound with practiced efficiency. "You've done this before," Nora observed, watching him secure the bandage. "Army Medical Corps during the war," he explained briefly. "Picked up a few skills." "The war ended 11 years ago," she calculated. "You couldn't have been more than 15. A shadow passed over his face. "Lied about my age. Joined up at 14 in '65 just before it ended. Saw enough in those few months to last a lifetime." Nora fell silent, understanding there were wounds that couldn't be seen with the naked eye. Her own father carried similar invisible scars from his time fighting in the Mexican-American War. As Yates built up the fire and set coffee to boil, Nora explained about her father's homestead, 10 miles outside of Montezuma, where they raised a small herd of cattle and grew what crops the short mountain growing season allowed. "Pa's getting on in years," she said, accepting the tin cup of coffee Yates handed her. "His joints pain him something fierce in winter. We needed supplies from town: flour, sugar, coffee, ammunition, and the money from our cattle sale was supposed to see us through until spring." "The money those men were after," Yates surmised. Nora nodded, her expression falling. "It's still in my saddlebag, but without the supplies." "First light tomorrow I'll see you safely to town," Yates promised. "Tonight you need rest." As darkness fell completely, the temperature dropped rapidly, as it often did in the Colorado mountains. Yates offered Nora his bedroll inside the tent, insisting he would be fine by the fire. Too exhausted and in too much pain to argue, she accepted the arrangement. Sleep came fitfully to Nora that night. The throbbing in her arm kept her drifting in and out of consciousness. During one period of wakefulness, she peered through the tent opening to see Yates sitting upright by the fire, his rifle across his knees, keeping watch. Something about the silhouette of this stranger who had come to her rescue stirred an unfamiliar feeling in her chest. Morning brought a clear sky and the promise of a warm autumn day. Yates had coffee brewing before Nora emerged from the tent, and he'd fashioned a sling for her injured arm from a spare shirt. "Your horse is still favoring that leg," he informed her. "You'll ride with me to town." After a simple breakfast of jerky and hardtack, Yates helped Nora onto his gelding, then swung up behind her. The proximity was uncomfortable at first. Nora had never been this close to a man who wasn't her father or brother, but the practicality of the situation overrode her sense of propriety. They rode at a steady pace, Yates leading Nora's limping mare behind them. The trail to Montezuma wound through stands of aspen trees, their leaves a brilliant gold against the blue Colorado sky. Despite the circumstances, Nora found herself noticing the warmth of Yates's chest against her back, the steady rhythm of his breathing. "Those men," she said after they'd been riding for some time. "They weren't just random bandits, were they?" Yates was silent for a moment. "No," he finally admitted. "I recognized one of them despite the mask. Works for Harlan Quinn." Nora stiffened at the name. Harlan Quinn had arrived in the county 2 years earlier, buying up mining claims and small ranches, often through questionable means. Her father had refused to sell their homestead despite increasingly generous offers from Quinn's representatives. "Quinn's been pressuring smaller ranchers to sell out," Yates continued. "Diamond Caticus owner, Mr. Kavanagh, has been fighting him tooth and nail. Those men weren't just after your money, Miss Miller. They were sending a message." The realization settled like a cold stone in Nora's stomach. This hadn't been a random robbery, it was a warning to her father. They crested a hill, and the town of Montezuma came into view in the valley below. Like many mining towns that had sprung up throughout the territory, it was a mixture of hasty construction and ambitious permanence wooden structures lining a main street, with the larger brick buildings of the assay office and bank anchoring the town center. As they rode down the main street, Nora was acutely aware of the curious glances from townspeople. A young woman arriving on horseback with a man, her arm in a sling and dried blood on her dress, was bound to cause talk. Yates seemed unbothered by the attention, guiding his horse directly to the doctor's office. Dr. William Hayes was a gruff man in his 50s who had come west seeking relief from his own consumption. The dry mountain air had improved his condition enough that he'd established a practice serving the miners, ranchers, and townsfolk of Montezuma and the surrounding area. "Bullet wound?" he asked without preamble as Yates helped Nora into the office. "Yes, sir," Yates replied. "I cleaned it as best I could." The doctor examined the wound with practiced efficiency. "Good field dressing," he commented, glancing at Yates. "You did this?" Yates nodded. "Well, you saved her from infection, most likely. Need to restitch it proper, though." While the doctor worked, Nora explained about the ambush. Sheriff Tanner was summoned, a weathered man with a gray-streaked mustache who listened to their account with growing concern. "Quinn's getting bolder," he muttered, making notes in a small book. Problem is, without seeing their faces clear and with them wearing masks, it's your word against theirs. One had a star-shaped spur on his right boot, Yates offered. Noticed it when they rode off. The sheriff's eyebrows rose. That would be Lyle Decker, Quinn's right-hand man. He sighed heavily. Still not enough for an arrest, but it helps to know who we're dealing with. After the sheriff left, promising to increase patrols on the roads leading to town, Dr. Hayes finished bandaging Nora's arm. Keep it clean and dry, he instructed. Come back in a week to have the stitches removed. He looked between Nora and Yates. You two married? No, they spoke in unison, both suddenly flustered. Well, it ain't proper for an unmarried woman to be traveling alone with a man, the doctor observed dryly, especially not overnight. It wasn't exactly planned, Doctor, Nora replied with as much dignity as she could muster. The doctor seemed unimpressed by this explanation. Well, what's done is done, but I suggest you get your supplies and head back to your father's place before more tongues start wagging. Nora thanked the doctor and paid his fee from her carefully guarded cattle money. Outside, Yates was waiting with both horses. Your mare's leg is better after the rest, but she's still not right, he said. I can escort you home after you've gotten your supplies. You've done more than enough, Mr. McAllister, Nora protested. I couldn't impose further. It's no imposition, he insisted. Quinn's men might try again. Besides, your father should know what's happened. Despite her independent nature, Nora recognized the wisdom in his words. They visited the general store, where she purchased the necessities her father needed. The shopkeeper, Mrs. Beatrice Holloway, made little attempt to hide her curiosity about Nora's companion and injury, but Nora provided only the briefest explanation. By mid-afternoon, they were on the trail again, Nora once more riding behind Yates while her mare, loaded with supplies, followed behind. The journey to the Miller homestead would take several hours, meaning they would arrive near sunset. As they rode, Nora found herself studying Yates's profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon. He wasn't classically handsome, but there was a quiet strength in his features that she found appealing. Tell me about the Diamond K, she said, breaking the comfortable silence that had fallen between them. How long have you worked there? Going on 3 years now, Yates replied. Mr. Kavanagh runs a good operation, fair to his hands, treats his stock well. And before that? Yates was quiet for a moment. Drifted mostly. After the war, I couldn't settle. Worked cattle drives in Texas, did some scouting for the Army, even panned for gold for a spell up in Dakota Territory. A faint smile touched his lips. Never found more than enough dust to buy supplies for the next week. What made you stop here? Nora asked, genuinely curious. He shrugged slightly. Colorado mountains have a way of getting under your skin. Saw the Rockies and something just set home in a way no place ever had before. Nora understood that feeling perfectly. Born in Missouri, she'd been only 5 when her father had loaded their wagon and headed west after her mother's death. The untamed beauty of the Colorado mountains had been her home ever since. The sun was indeed beginning to set when they finally reached the Miller homestead, a sturdy log cabin with a barn and corral situated in a protected valley with a clear stream running nearby. Several dozen cattle grazed on the autumn gold grass of the surrounding pasture. As they approached, the door to the cabin flew open and Jacob Miller emerged, rifle in hand. At 57, he was still a formidable figure, though years of hard labor had stooped his once straight shoulders and whitened his beard. Nora, he called out, relief evident in his voice. I was about to ride to town looking for you. His gaze shifted suspiciously to Yates. Who's this? Dismounting carefully to protect her injured arm, Nora quickly explained what had happened. Jacob's weathered face darkened with anger as he heard about the ambush, then softened as he learned of Yates's intervention. "You saved my daughter's life," he said gruffly, extending his hand to Yates. "I'm in your debt, Mr. McAllister." "Any decent man would have done the same," Yates replied, accepting the handshake. "Not in my experience," Jacob said with a snort. "Come inside, both of you. Least I can do is offer you a hot meal and a place to sleep before you head back to the Diamond K tomorrow." The inside of the Miller cabin was simple but comfortable, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and handcrafted furniture arranged throughout the main room. Photographs in wooden frames, including one of a young woman who bore a striking resemblance to Nora, presumably her late mother, decorated the mantel. Jacob insisted on preparing dinner himself, shooing Nora to a chair to rest her injured arm. As they ate a hearty stew with fresh baked bread, the conversation turned inevitably to Harlan Quinn and his escalating tactics. "He sent a man last week offering double what this place is worth," Jacob revealed. "When I refused, he hinted that the mountains can be dangerous for an old man and his daughter. That's why they came after me," Nora said, the pieces falling into place. "It wasn't just robbery, it was a warning. Quinn's doing the same all over the county," Yates added. "Mr. Kavanagh believes he's trying to control the water rights for the entire valley." Jacob nodded grimly. "The stream that runs through our property feeds into the main river that supplies most of the ranches downstream, including the Diamond K. If Quinn controls the headwaters," Yates began. "He controls every ranch in the valley," Jacob finished. "And with silver being found in these hills, the land values are skyrocketing." After dinner, Jacob insisted Yates take the small guest room while he retreated to his own bedroom. Nora remained by the fire, her thoughts too turbulent for sleep. The reality of their situation was sinking in. Quinn wouldn't stop with one failed attempt. Hearing footsteps, she looked up to find Yates had returned to the main room, a concerned expression on his face. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, taking a seat in the chair opposite her. Nora shook her head. "Thinking about Quinn, what his next move might be." "Your father seems like a man who can handle himself," Yates observed. "He is," Nora agreed. "But he's not as young as he once was, and his war injuries trouble him more with each passing winter." She stared into the flames. "This land is everything to him, to both of us. I can't bear the thought of losing it." "You won't," Yates said with quiet conviction. "Quinn's powerful, but he's not invincible." Something in his tone made Nora look up sharply. "What are you suggesting?" "Nothing illegal," he assured her. "But Mr. Kavanagh has been gathering evidence of Quinn's underhanded dealings. If enough ranchers stand together, the territorial governor might be persuaded to investigate." "And until then?" Nora asked. Yates's expression turned serious. "Until then, you and your father need to be careful. Never ride alone, keep your weapons close." The gravity of their situation settled over them like a heavy blanket. For a long moment neither spoke, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the room. "Why did you really help me, Mr. McAllister?" Nora asked suddenly. "The truth." Yates seemed taken aback by the directness of her question. "I told you any decent man would have. Perhaps. But you've gone well beyond what any decent man might do." Her eyes held his steadily. "You could have brought me to town and been done with it." He looked away, his gaze returning to the fire. "I've seen what happens when good people stand by while others suffer. After the war." He paused, seeming to search for words. "I promised myself I'd never again walk away from someone who needed help." There was more to the story, Nora sensed, but she didn't press. Whatever ghosts haunted Yates McAllister, they had shaped him into the man who had come to her rescue when she needed it most. "Well, I'm grateful," she said simply. And I hope you know you'll always be welcome at the Miller homestead." The smile that crossed his face then transformed his features, lighting his eyes and revealing a dimple in his right cheek. "I'll remember that, Miss Miller." "Nora," she corrected. "After all we've been through, I think you've earned the right to use my given name." "Nora," he repeated, the name sounding different somehow in his deep voice. "Then you must call me Yates." Their eyes held for a moment longer than necessary, and Nora felt a curious fluttering sensation in her chest. Suddenly self-conscious, she stood, wincing slightly as the movement jostled her injured arm. "I should get some rest," she said. "Good night, Yates." "Good night, Nora," he replied softly. As she settled into her bed, Nora found her thoughts drifting not to the danger they faced from Quinn, but to the way Yates's eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. It was a dangerous distraction, she knew, but one she couldn't seem to help. Morning came with a heavy frost coating the grass and a thin layer of ice on the water troughs. After a hearty breakfast, Yates prepared to depart, despite Jacob's insistence he could stay longer. "Mr. Kavanagh will be expecting me back," he explained. "And he should know about Quinn's latest move." Jacob nodded in understanding. "You're welcome here any time, son. My door's always open to you." Nora walked with Yates to the corral where his horse waited, saddled and ready. An awkward silence fell between them, neither quite knowing how to say goodbye. "Will you be all right?" Yates asked finally, gesturing to her bandaged arm. "It's already feeling better," she assured him. "Dr. Hayes said I was lucky another inch and the bullet might have hit bone." Yates's expression darkened at the reminder of how close she'd come to serious injury or worse. "Be careful, Nora. Quinn's men won't hesitate to try again." "I will," she promised. "You be careful, too." He mounted his horse in one fluid motion, then surprised her by reaching down to take her hand. "I'll check on you in a few days," he said, his fingers warm against hers despite the morning chill. "Make sure that arm's healing properly." Nora nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She watched as he rode away, following his progress until he disappeared over the ridge that marked the boundary of the Miller property. Over the following weeks, Yates became a regular visitor to the Miller homestead. His first visit, 3 days after the ambush, was ostensibly to check on Nora's recovery. The second, a week later, coincided with his delivery of news from Mr. Kavanagh. The Diamond K owner was organizing a meeting of local ranchers to discuss united action against Quinn. By his third visit, the pretense of necessity had fallen away. Yates would ride over after his work at the Diamond K was done, sometimes staying for dinner, other times just sharing coffee on the porch as the autumn days grew shorter and the first snows dusted the highest peaks. Jacob observed the growing connection between his daughter and the young cowboy with quiet approval. He'd worried about Nora's future, knowing she deserved more than a life of isolation on their remote homestead. Yates McAllister, with his straightforward manner and obvious respect for both Millers, seemed like a good man. November brought heavier snows and the ranchers meeting at the Diamond K. Jacob and Nora attended, riding over together on a clear but frigid morning. 12 ranchers in total had gathered in the main house, a substantial log structure that reflected the success of Brendan Kavanagh's cattle operation. Kavanagh himself proved to be a robust Irishman in his 50s with a booming voice and shrewd blue eyes. He welcomed the Millers warmly, giving Yates an approving nod when the young cowhand took a protective stance near Nora. "Quinn's been busy," Kavanagh announced once everyone was seated. 3 more small ranchers have sold out in the past month. 2 reported accidents that destroyed their winter feed stores just before they decided to sell. A murmur of anger rippled through the assembled ranchers. "We've gathered evidence of Quinn's methods," Kavanagh continued, indicating a stack of papers on the table. Witness statements, documentation of threats, records of water rights that have been suspiciously altered at the county office. Sheriff Tanner, who was also present, picked up the thread. It's enough to take to the territorial governor, but we need to move carefully. Quinn has friends in high places investments from Denver businessmen who don't care how he turns a profit, so long as he does. Meanwhile, what are we supposed to do? Demanded one rancher. Sit and wait for Quinn's men to burn us out. We stand together, Kavanagh replied firmly. No one rides alone. We establish regular patrols of our boundaries, share resources where needed. The meeting continued for hours, with detailed plans being made for mutual defense and support. Yates contributed several practical suggestions, drawing on his military experience. Nora noticed the respect with which the other men treated him, despite his youth and employee status. As the meeting concluded and people began to disperse, Yates approached Nora and her father. "I've spoken with Mr. Kavanagh," he said. "With his permission, I'd like to stay at your place for a few weeks, just until things settle with Quinn." Jacob's eyebrows rose. "As much as we appreciate the offer, son, I can't ask you to leave your position here." "You're not asking, I'm offering," Yates replied. "And Mr. Kavanagh agrees it's a good idea. Your place is isolated, and after what happened to Nora." He left the sentence unfinished. Jacob looked to Kavanagh, who had approached to join their conversation. The ranch owner nodded. "Yates is one of my best hands, but he's right, your homestead is vulnerable. Consider it the Diamond Katek's contribution to our mutual defense." That evening, Yates rode back to the Miller homestead with them, his belongings packed in his saddlebags. Jacob set him up in the small room off the main cabin that had originally been built as a storage space, but had been converted to a spare bedroom years ago. Having Yates as a constant presence in their home changed the dynamic in subtle but significant ways. He proved himself useful beyond security, pitching in with the daily chores of ranch life, mending fences, caring for the livestock, and hunting to supplement their winter stores. For Nora, his presence was both comforting and unsettling. Comforting because she felt safer knowing he was there, his quiet competence a reassurance against Quinn's threats. Unsettling because with each passing day, she found herself more drawn to him, more aware of him as a man rather than simply her rescuer. They fell into an easy routine. Mornings were for essential chores, feeding animals, breaking ice on the water troughs, tending the small herd. Afternoons often found Nora and Yates working side by side on repairs to the barn or cabin as winter set in earnest. Evenings were spent around the fireplace, with Jacob often recounting tales of the early days in Colorado territory, while Yates listened with genuine interest. In those quiet evenings, Nora began to learn more about the man who had come to her rescue. Yates spoke little of his childhood, revealing only that he had been orphaned young and raised by an uncle in Missouri who had little interest in an extra mouth to feed. The war had been both escape and education, thrusting him into manhood before his time. "I was a scout mostly," he explained one evening when Jacob pressed for details. "Small for my age, so I could move quietly, reported troop movements, supply lines." The shadows in his eyes suggested there was more to the story, but neither Miller pushed. December arrived with a heavy snowstorm that isolated the homestead for nearly a week. The forced confinement might have been awkward, but instead, it deepened the bonds between them. Yates taught Nora to play chess using a set Jacob had carved years ago. She, in turn, shared her mother's recipes, guiding Yates through the preparation of sourdough biscuits that became his specialty. On the fifth night of the storm, Jacob retired early, his old wounds troubling him in the cold. Nora and Yates remained by the fire, the chess board between them forgotten as they talked long into the night. The conversation turned, as it sometimes did, to dreams for the future. "I'd like to have my own spread someday," Yates admitted. "Nothing as big as the Diamond K, but enough land to run a decent herd, a place to put down roots." "You've never thought of going back east?" Nora asked. He shook his head. "Nothing for me there. The West." He gestured toward the window where snow continued to fall in the darkness. "Out here, a man is judged by his actions, not his past or his family name." "And what about a family of your own?" The question slipped out before Nora could reconsider it. Yates's gaze lifted to meet hers, his expression softening. "I've thought about it, more often lately." There was something in the way he looked at her then that made Nora's heart beat faster. The right woman could make all the difference between a house and a home. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with unspoken possibility. Nora became acutely aware of how alone they were, the rest of the house silent except for the crackling of the fire. Yates leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. "Nora!" A sudden crash from outside shattered the moment. Both jumped to their feet, Yates reaching for the rifle that was never far from his side these days. "Stay here," he ordered, moving cautiously toward the window. Nora ignored the command, grabbing her own shotgun from its place near the door. Years of living in the wilderness had taught her not to cower in the face of potential danger. Peering through the frost-edged window, they saw nothing but swirling snow in the darkness. Then came another crash, this time clearly from the direction of the barn. "The livestock," Nora whispered. Without hesitation, Yates began pulling on his coat and boots. "Wake your father. Bar the door behind me. If I'm not back in 10 minutes, fire a warning shot." "I'm coming with you," Nora insisted. "No," he said firmly. "If it's Quinn's men, I need to know you're safe." Before she could argue further, he was out the door, disappearing into the blinding snow. Nora rushed to wake her father, explaining the situation in hurried whispers. Jacob was instantly alert, checking his own rifle as he joined Nora at the window. 5 minutes passed with agonizing slowness. Then 10. "I'm going after him," Nora declared, reaching for her coat. Jacob caught her arm. "Wait." Just as he spoke, the door burst open and Yates staggered in, snow coating his clothes and hair. "Mountain lion," he reported, stamping snow from his boots. "Got into the chicken coop. Managed to scare it off, but we lost 3 hens." The tension in the room dissolved into relief. Jacob set about stoking the fire while Nora helped Yates out of his snow-crusted coat, noticing with alarm that his hands were red and stiff with cold. "You're half frozen," she scolded, leading him to the fire. Without thinking, she took his hands between her own, rubbing gently to restore circulation. The simple act of warming his hands somehow felt more intimate than any conversation they'd shared. Yates's eyes found hers, and the intensity of his gaze caused her breath to catch. For a long moment, neither moved, the connection between them palpable. Jacob cleared his throat, breaking the spell. "Think I'll turn in again," he announced, a knowing gleam in his eye. "Yates, you might want to have some hot coffee before you do the same. Night air's bitter cold." Left alone once more, Nora busied herself preparing coffee, conscious of Yates's eyes following her movements. When she handed him the steaming cup, their fingers brushed, sending a jolt of awareness through her. "Thank you," he said, his voice lower than usual. "Not just for the coffee, for everything." "I should be thanking you," she replied. "You've done so much for us, for me." "I've done what any man would do for." He paused, seeming to search for the right word. "For what?" Nora prompted, her heart suddenly racing. "For someone who matters to him," Yates finished, setting down his coffee cup and rising to his feet. With deliberate slowness, he closed the distance between them. Standing before her, he reached out to brush a strand of hair from her face, his touch feather light. "You matter to me, Nora, more than I expected, more than might be wise given everything that's happening." Nora should have stepped back, should have maintained the proper distance between them. Instead, she found herself leaning slightly into his touch. "You matter to me too, Yates." His hand cupped her cheek, and she saw the question in his eyes a request for permission. Her slight nod was all the answer he needed. When his lips met hers, the contact was gentle at first, tentative. Then, as she responded, the kiss deepened, his arms encircling her waist as hers wound around his neck. The world beyond them ceased to exist. There was only this moment, this connection that had been building since the day he had ridden to her rescue. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Yates rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that since that first night by this fire," he admitted. "Why did you wait so long?" Nora asked, her hands still resting on his shoulders. A smile tugged at his lips. "Wasn't sure your father wouldn't shoot me." Nora laughed softly. "He likes you." "I think he'd be more likely to hand you a shotgun and march us to the preacher." As soon as the words left her mouth, she realized their implication and felt heat rise to her cheeks. But Yates didn't pull away. Instead, his expression grew serious. "Would that be so terrible?" he asked quietly. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility. Before Nora could formulate a response, a sharp knock at the door startled them both. Yates moved instantly into a defensive posture, retrieving his rifle as Nora stepped behind him. "Who would be out in this storm?" she whispered. "No one with good intentions," he replied grimly. Raising his voice, he called out, "Who's there?" "Sheriff Tanner," came the reply. "Got urgent news. Let me in before I freeze solid." Yates opened the door cautiously, rifle still ready, but it was indeed the sheriff who stumbled in, snow coating his heavy buffalo coat. Jacob emerged from his bedroom at the commotion, pulling on a robe. "What brings you out in this weather, Sheriff?" he asked as Nora hurried to pour another cup of coffee for their unexpected visitor. Tanner gratefully accepted the hot drink, warming his hands around the cup before speaking. "Quinn's made his move. Hired guns arrived yesterday, a dozen of them, staying at the hotel in town. Word is they're planning to drive out any ranchers who haven't sold by Christmas." "Drive out or kill?" Yates asked bluntly. The sheriff's grim expression was answer enough. "Cavanaugh sent riders to warn everyone. I volunteered to reach you since I was heading this direction anyway." "You're a good 3 hours from town in good weather," Jacob observed. "And this is about as far from good weather as it gets." Tanner nodded. "Was on my way back from the Morrison place up north when the storm hit. Figured I'd detour here rather than risk getting lost." He glanced between Yates and Nora, seemingly noting their proximity but making no comment. "Cavanaugh's calling all the ranchers to his place the day after tomorrow. Says it's time to make a stand." The implications were clear. Quinn was escalating from threats and intimidation to outright violence. If the ranchers didn't unite, they would be picked off one by one. "We'll be there," Jacob assured the sheriff. "Storm's supposed to break tomorrow afternoon." Tanner stayed the night, sleeping on a pallet near the fire. The next morning dawned clear, the storm having blown itself out overnight. After a hearty breakfast, the sheriff departed, continuing his rounds to warn the remaining outlying ranches. As soon as he was gone, preparations began for the journey to the Diamond K. The deep snow would make travel slow, and they needed to secure the homestead before leaving. Working side by side to bank the fires and ensure the livestock had adequate feed and water, Nora and Yates found few opportunities for private conversation. The weight of the sheriff's news hung over them, pushing their personal revelations temporarily aside. It wasn't until late afternoon, as they were checking the tack for their horses, that Yates found a moment alone with Nora in the barn. "About last night," he began, his voice low. "What I asked you, you don't need to explain," Nora interrupted, suddenly afraid he would say it had been a mistake, a momentary weakness. "Yes, I do." He stepped closer, taking her hands in his. "I meant what I said, Nora, what I was trying to ask. But with everything that's happening with Quinn, it complicates things," she acknowledged. "It does." His thumbs traced circles on the backs of her hands, but it also makes some things clearer. Life out here is uncertain at the best of times. When you find something worth holding on to, someone worth fighting for, you don't let go. Nora's heart swelled at his words. "Is that what I am to you? Someone worth fighting for? You're everything to me," Yates said simply. "From the moment I heard those shots and found you on that trail, something changed. I've been alone most of my life, Nora. Never felt like I belonged anywhere or to anyone, until you." Tears pricked at Nora's eyes. "I feel the same," she whispered. "When you're here, it's like a piece that was missing has finally found its place." He released her hands to cup her face gently between his palms. "Then when this business with Quinn is settled, one way or another, I want to do this properly. Talk to your father. Make a life with you if you'll have me." "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Whatever comes, my answer is yes." Their lips met in a kiss that sealed the promise between them, a beacon of hope amid the gathering storm they faced. The next morning, the three of them set out for the Diamond K, armed and vigilant. The recent snowfall had transformed the landscape, the pristine white broken only by the occasional tracks of wildlife. Under different circumstances, the journey might have been beautiful. They arrived at the Cavanaugh Ranch by mid-afternoon to find the yard already filled with horses and wagons. Inside the main house, nearly 20 ranchers had gathered, their faces grave as they listened to Brendan Cavanaugh outline what they knew of Quinn's plans. "His hired guns have split into groups of 3, Cavanaugh explained, indicating points on a crude map of the county. "They're targeting the most isolated homesteads first, thinking to eliminate resistance before moving on to larger spreads." Sheriff Tanner stood beside him, adding, "I've wired the territorial governor requesting militia support, but it could be days before they respond, let alone arrive." "We can't wait for the government to save us," one rancher called out. "By then, half of us could be dead and our ranches burning." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. "What do you propose?" Jacob asked, his voice cutting through the growing tension. Cavanaugh's expression hardened. "We form our own militia. Every able-bodied man among us. We stand together, defend each property as if it were our own." The plan that emerged was both simple and dangerous. The ranchers would divide into groups, each responsible for patrolling and protecting a section of the valley. At the first sign of trouble, signal fires would be lit on the highest points of each property, visible for miles in the clear winter air. "What about the women and children?" someone asked. "The Diamond K main house is the most defensible position," Cavanaugh replied. "Those who can't fight can shelter here." Nora bristled at the assumption that she would be among those who needed sheltering. Catching Yates's eye across the room, she saw from his slight smile that he understood her reaction perfectly. When the meeting broke up, assignments being distributed and plans finalized, Yates found her and her father near the fireplace. "Mr. Miller," he said formally, "I'd like to speak with you privately if I may." Jacob glanced between the young cowboy and his daughter, noting the way they stood not touching, but somehow connected nonetheless. With a knowing nod, he followed Yates to a quiet corner of the room. Nora watched them from a distance, her heart pounding as she guessed the nature of their conversation. She couldn't hear the words, but she could see the earnest expression on Yates's face, the thoughtful consideration in her father's. Then, to her immense relief, Jacob smiled and extended his hand. The two men shook, her father clapping Yates on the shoulder with obvious approval. When they returned to her side, Jacob's eyes were suspiciously bright. "Well, daughter," he said gruffly, "seems this young man has honorable intentions toward you. And you approve?" Nora asked, though she already knew the answer. "Would be a fool not to," Jacob replied. "Man who risks his life for my daughter before even knowing her name is the kind of man I'd be proud to call family." Yates reached for Nora's hand, entwining his fingers with hers. The simple gesture, performed openly in front of her father and the assembled ranchers, was a declaration in itself. "Once this business with Quinn is settled," Jacob continued, "we'll make it official. But for now, we need to focus on keeping our land and our lives." The groups departed the next morning, each to their assigned areas. Yates, Nora, and Jacob would return to their homestead, joined by two other ranchers whose properties were nearby. Kavanagh had insisted on sending one of his ranch hands with them, as well as a seasoned frontiersman named Caleb, who had fought Indians with the cavalry. The plan was to establish a rotation, with two men always on watch while the others rested. Nora insisted on taking her turn at guard duty, her skill with a rifle beyond question. After some initial resistance, the men agreed, recognizing that in their situation, every capable defender was needed, regardless of gender. 3 days passed in watchful tension. Snow fell again, lighter this time, dusting the landscape with fresh powder that would make approaching riders easier to spot. On the 4th morning, Yates and Nora took the dawn watch together, positioned on the small rise behind the cabin that offered the best view of the surrounding valley. The sunrise painted the snow-covered mountains in shades of gold and pink, the beauty of it almost making them forget the danger they faced. Almost. "If things were different," Yates said quietly, "this would be a perfect moment." Nora glanced at him, her breath clouding in the frigid air. "It still is in its way. We're together, the rest." She shrugged. "The rest we'll face as it comes." He smiled, reaching out to take her hand, their gloved fingers interlacing. "When did you get so wise?" "Had a good teacher," she replied, leaning against his shoulder. "My father always says trouble comes whether you worry about it or not, so you might as well appreciate the good moments when they're here." Yates's response was interrupted by the distant sound of hoofbeats. Both straightened immediately, hands moving to their weapons as they scanned the horizon. A lone rider approached from the direction of town, pushing his horse hard through the deep snow. As he drew closer, Nora recognized the weathered buffalo coat of Sheriff Tanner. They hurried down to the cabin, rousing the others. By the time Tanner reached them, all 6 defenders were arrayed in front of the house, weapons ready. The sheriff's expression was grim as he dismounted. "Quinn's men hit the Larson place at dawn," he reported without preamble. "Burned the barn, shot John Larson when he came out to investigate. He'll live, but only because his son got him to town in time." "The signal fire," Jacob asked, referring to their warning system, "never got lit. They came in quick and quiet like they knew exactly when to strike." Tanner's implication was clear. Quinn had informants among them. "Where are they headed next?" Yates asked, his arm instinctively moving around Nora's shoulders. Tanner shook his head. "Don't know for certain, but one of Quinn's men was overheard in the saloon saying something about the old man and his daughter being next, given what happened to Nora before." He left the sentence unfinished. "They're coming here," Nora said, stating what they all realized. "How many?" Jacob demanded. "At least 4, maybe more," the sheriff answered. I rode ahead to warn you. Kavanagh's gathering men, but they're scattered across the county. Could be hours before help arrives. How long do we have? Yates asked. Tanner glanced at the sun, now fully risen. They left town not long after I did, but they'll move slower as a group. 2 hours, maybe 3. It wasn't much time, but it would have to be enough. They quickly formed a plan. The cabin, with its thick log walls and few windows, would be their stronghold. The barn, more vulnerable to fire, would be abandoned. The horses moved to a protected ravine behind the house where they might escape notice. Caleb and one of the neighboring ranchers would take positions in the root cellar, which had a small window offering a clear line of fire to anyone approaching from the east. Jacob and the other rancher would defend the cabin itself. Yates, Nora, and Sheriff Tanner would position themselves in the loft of the cabin, where narrow gun ports allowed them to cover the main approach from the north. As they prepared, checking weapons and moving essential supplies into the cabin, Yates pulled Nora aside. "I want you to promise me something," he said, his expression intense. "If things go badly, if it looks like we can't hold them off, I want you to take the trail behind the house. It leads up to the old mine shaft. You could hide there until help arrives." Nora's eyes flashed with determination. "I'm not running, Yates. This is my home, our home. I'll defend it alongside you." "Nora, would you run?" she challenged. "Leave me and my father to face Quinn's men alone." His silence was answer enough. "Then don't ask me to do what you wouldn't," she said softly. "Whatever comes, we face it together." He gazed at her for a long moment, conflict evident in his eyes. Then, with a resigned nod, he pulled her into a fierce embrace. "Together," he agreed. "But stay close to me. I only just found you. I'm not losing you now." Their preparations were barely complete when the lookout stationed on the rise behind the cabin called out a warning. Riders approaching from the north, 6 of them, moving at a steady pace through the snow. Everyone took their positions, weapons loaded and ready. In the loft, Nora knelt beside Yates at one of the gun ports, Sheriff Tanner at another. Through the narrow opening, she could see the approaching riders clearly now, their breath and that of their horses creating plumes of vapor in the cold air. "That's Lyle Decker in the lead," Tanner murmured, referring to Quinn's right-hand man. "The others are hired guns from down Texas way." As the riders drew closer, they spread out in a semicircle, staying just beyond effective rifle range. Decker raised a hand, signaling the others to halt. "Miller," he called out. "Jacob Miller, we know you're in there. Mr. Quinn sent us to deliver a message." Jacob moved to the cabin's front window, keeping to the side to avoid presenting a target. "I'm listening," he shouted back. "Mr. Quinn is tired of asking nicely," Decker continued. "He's offering one last chance, $5,000 for your property. Take it and ride out today with your lives. Refuse and—" He left the threat hanging. "My answer hasn't changed," Jacob replied steadily. "This land isn't for sale, not at any price." Decker's laugh carried across the snow-covered yard. "Thought you might say that. Well, old man, hope you've made your peace with your maker." With that, he raised his arm again, this time in a signal to attack. The riders spurred their horses forward, guns drawn as they charged toward the cabin. "Wait for my signal," Tanner instructed, his voice calm despite the danger bearing down on them. "Let them get closer." Nora's heart pounded in her chest, her finger poised on the trigger of her rifle. Beside her, Yates was a study in controlled tension, his breathing steady as he sighted down his weapon. When the riders were halfway across the open ground, Tanner gave the command. "Fire!" The coordinated volley from the defenders took the attackers by surprise. 2 riders fell immediately, one clutching his shoulder while the other tumbled lifelessly from his saddle. The remaining 4 scattered, seeking cover behind the woodpile and water trough. What followed was a tense exchange of gunfire, with bullets thudding into the thick logs of the cabin while the defenders returned fire whenever one of Quinn's men exposed themselves. The standoff continued for nearly an hour, neither side gaining a clear advantage. Then Decker changed tactics. "Get to the barn," he shouted to one of his men. "Burn it. They're trying to smoke us out," Tanner growled. "Hoping we'll try to save the livestock or supplies." "Joke's on them," Yates replied grimly. "Nothing in there but empty stalls." Nevertheless, they watched as one of Quinn's men made a dash for the barn, a flaming torch in hand. Nora took careful aim and fired, her bullet striking the man in the leg. He fell, dropping the torch into the snow where it sizzled and went out. Decker cursed loudly, then shouted new orders to his remaining men. They began firing in a more concentrated pattern, focusing on the cabin's few windows while Decker himself edged toward their fallen comrade, presumably to retrieve the idea of the torch. "He's going to try for the barn again," Nora predicted. "Not if I can help it," Yates muttered, adjusting his position for a better angle. Just as Decker reached the wounded man, Yates fired. The bullet struck Decker's arm, causing him to drop his weapon with a howl of pain. The tide of battle was turning in favor of the defenders. Then, disaster struck. One of Quinn's men managed to circle behind the cabin unseen. His first shot shattered the window near where Jacob stood, sending splinters of glass and wood into the older man's face. As Jacob staggered back, temporarily blinded, a second shot caught him in the side. "Father!" Nora cried, abandoning her position and racing down the loft ladder. She reached Jacob as he collapsed onto the cabin floor, blood spreading across his shirt. The neighboring rancher who had been positioned with him was returning fire through the broken window, keeping the attacker at bay. "How bad is it?" Yates asked, appearing at her side. Nora's hands trembled as she tore open her father's shirt to examine the wound. "The bullet went through his side," she reported, pressing a cloth against the bleeding entry and exit wounds. "But he's losing a lot of blood." Jacob's eyes fluttered open, focusing with difficulty on his daughter's face. "Did I miss all the excitement?" he asked weakly. "Save your strength, Pa," Nora urged, tears threatening to spill from her eyes. A shout from outside drew their attention. "Miller, you've got one man down already. How many more need to die before you see sense?" It was Decker again, his voice strained with pain from his own wound but no less determined. "They don't know how many of us are in here," Tanner observed, joining them from his position in the loft. "Might be able to use that to our advantage." Before they could formulate a plan, the sound of distant hoofbeats reached them, many horses, approaching fast from the direction of the Diamond K. "The reinforcements," Yates breathed, a smile breaking across his face. "Kavanagh's men." Decker and his remaining men heard it too. There was a hurried conference among them, then the sound of retreating horses as they abandoned their attack, fleeing across the snow-covered valley. "They're running," the rancher at the window reported jubilantly. But Nora's attention remained fixed on her father, whose breathing had grown labored. "He needs a doctor," she said urgently. Sheriff Tanner knelt beside them, examining Jacob's wound with a practiced eye. "Bullet missed anything vital from the look of it, but the blood loss is serious. Need to get him to Doc Hayes in town." Within minutes, the yard outside filled with riders, Kavanagh himself leading a group of 15 armed men, including several from his own ranch. When they learned of Jacob's condition, a wagon was quickly prepared, padded with blankets to transport the wounded man to Montezuma. "Go with your father," Yates told Nora as they helped load Jacob into the wagon. "I'll stay here with some of Kavanagh's men to secure the homestead." Nora shook her head. "We stay together, remember. Besides, my father would want someone he trusts watching over the place. Her eyes held his. I trust you, Yates, more than anyone. After a moment's hesitation, he nodded. All right, but promise you'll send word as soon as the doctor sees him. I promise. As the wagon departed, accompanied by Sheriff Tanner and several armed men as escort, Nora watched until it disappeared from sight. The attack had been repelled, but at what cost? And would Quinn's men return with greater numbers once they regrouped? Kavanagh approached, his weathered face grim. We caught one of Quinn's men on the road, he informed them. Wounded in the initial exchange, he's talking, hoping for leniency. What's he saying? Yates asked. Enough to hang Quinn 10 times over, Kavanagh replied with satisfaction. Detailed Quinn's plans to drive out every independent rancher in the valley, forging deeds, threatening witnesses, arranging accidents for those who wouldn't sell. Will it be enough for the authorities? Nora asked, knowing how often powerful men escape justice through connections and bribes. Kavanagh's smile was fierce. Already wired the evidence to the territorial governor's office. He's dispatching federal marshals, should arrive within the week. The news brought a measure of relief, though Nora's worry for her father overshadowed everything else. As night fell, she found herself standing on the porch, staring in the direction of town, as if she could somehow will news to reach her faster. Yates joined her, draping a warm blanket around her shoulders. He's going to be all right, he said softly. Your father's the toughest man I know. I keep telling myself that, Nora replied, leaning into his embrace. But if I lost him? You won't, Yates assured her. And you're not alone, Nora, not anymore. They stood together in the cold night air, finding comfort in each other's presence as stars appeared one by one in the clear winter sky above. Word came the following morning Jacob was stable, the doctor confident of his recovery given time and proper care. The bullet had passed through his side without damaging vital organs, and while blood loss had weakened him, his overall health was good for a man his age. The news lifted an enormous weight from Nora's shoulders. With her father in good hands in town, she could turn her attention to securing the homestead. Kavanagh left 4 of his men to help with repairs and stand guard, promising to send more supplies from the Diamond K. Over the next few days, Nora and Yates worked alongside Kavanagh's men to repair the damage from the attack. Windows were boarded up until new glass could be obtained from Denver. Bullet holes in the cabin walls were patched, and the corral fence that had been damaged during the gunfight was rebuilt. Through it all, their growing feelings for each other deepened, strengthened by the adversity they had faced together. Each night, they would sit by the fire, planning for a future that now seemed within reach, a future together. 5 days after the attack, Sheriff Tanner arrived with momentous news. Federal marshals took Quinn into custody this morning, he announced. Found him trying to flee to Denver. His hired guns are scattered or arrested, and the evidence against him is overwhelming. It's over. Nora asked, hardly daring to believe it. As good as, Tanner confirmed. The territorial governor himself has taken an interest in the case. Quinn won't be troubling this valley again. The relief was palpable. That evening, they celebrated with a special dinner, inviting Kavanagh's men to join them. For the first time since the ambush on the trail weeks ago, Nora felt the weight of fear and uncertainty lift completely. After the others had retired for the night, she and Yates walked under the stars, their breaths mingling in the cold air. I was thinking, Yates said, his hand warm around hers. Once your father's recovered enough to travel, we should take that trip to town. Nora glanced up at him questioningly. What trip? A smile played at his lips. The one where I make good on my promise to do things properly. His eyes held hers. I meant what I said, Nora. I want to marry you, build a life with you right here on this land you love so much. What about your dream? Your own spread? She asked softly. Some dreams change when you find something more important, he replied. Besides, your father mentioned he could use a partner to help expand the operation. Said something about his future son-in-law having good ideas about crossbreeding cattle for the high country. Nora's heart swelled with joy. So you've already discussed business arrangements with him. Seemed prudent, Yates admitted with a grin. Man wants to know his daughter will be provided for. Laughing, Nora threw her arms around his neck. Yes, she said simply. Yes to all of it. Their kiss, beneath the vast canopy of stars, sealed a promise born in danger, and nurtured through adversity a love as enduring as the mountains that surrounded them. 2 weeks later, Jacob Miller returned home, still moving gingerly but well on the road to recovery. He observed with quiet approval the changes in the homestead, and in his daughter and the young cowboy, who had saved her life that fateful day on the trail to town. As spring approached, bringing new green growth to the valley, Nora Miller became Nora McAllister in a simple ceremony in Montezuma's small church. The entire community turned out to celebrate a testament to the bonds forged during their united stand against Quinn's tyranny. Brendan Kavanagh presented the couple with a wedding gift of 10 prime heifers to strengthen their breeding stock. Sheriff Tanner, now a close friend, offered a more practical present, a new Winchester rifle for each of them. Just in case, he said with a wink. As for Quinn, he was convicted on multiple counts of conspiracy, attempted murder, and fraud. His sentence, 20 years in the territorial prison, ensured he would trouble the honest ranchers of the valley no more. The Miller-McAllister Ranch, as it came to be known, prospered under the combined efforts of Jacob, Yates, and Nora. Their cattle operation expanded, and within a few years, they had one of the most successful breeding programs in the county. In the summer of 1879, their family grew with the birth of a son, whom they named Daniel Jacob McAllister. 2 years later, a daughter, Emma Rose, joined the family. As the children grew, they learned the stories of how their parents met, of shots fired on a lonely trail, of a brave cowboy who came running, and of the love that bloomed amid danger and uncertainty. On crisp autumn evenings, much like the one when Nora had first been ambushed, the family would gather on the porch of the expanded homestead. Jacob, his hair now fully white but his spirit undiminished, would entertain the children with tales of the early days in Colorado territory. Nora and Yates would sit side by side, her head resting on his shoulder, his arm around her waist, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. In those peaceful moments, the dangers they had faced seemed distant memories, overshadowed by the life they had built together. Any regrets? Yates would sometimes ask, though he knew the answer, and Nora would always reply the same way, her eyes filled with love for the man who had heard gunshots on a distant trail and come running toward danger rather than away from it. Not a single one, she would say, leaning up to kiss him. Not a single one,